Auburn needs help. But is Bryan Harsin the guy who can rescue Auburn, or is he actually hurting Auburn? Auburn's in a position right now where they're losing coaches left and right. They're losing players left and right. And I covered Auburn for 7-8 years, as many of you know, and I still know a lot of people in Auburn, including people in the Auburn Athletics Complex that I still talk to. And I'm hurting for them, honestly, because they're seeing things kind of fall apart around them, and they're almost helpless in being able to fix it. And so on the heels of the news that Austin Davis, the recently hired offensive coordinator at Auburn, was departing for personal reasons, which sources told me was related to just the pressures of the job as far as involved with recruiting and the expectations there. Auburn is now looking to replace a sixth coach in a calendar year under Bryan Harsin. Bryan Harsin arrived in December of 2020. He's been on campus for 14 months, less than 14 months, and he's already had to replace 6 coaches. Only 2 of his coaches, those 6, by the way, ended up coaching the entire season last year. Is there trouble on the plains? Yes. Is it impossible to dig out of this rut? No. We've seen Auburn do it before. But this is an inflection point for Auburn. They're coming off right now a transfer portal cycle that has been vicious to them. They've lost 18 players, 8 of them defensive linemen or pass rushers. 8. And 2 of those guys are probably going to be starters at SEC West rival at Ole Miss next season. So they're going to be lining up against these guys in their own conference. You lose Derek Mason, your defensive coordinator, to Oklahoma State. Why? Sources told me there's philosophical and personal differences with Bryan Harsin that led to Mason leaving the staff after less than a year there on the Plains. He's a fantastic defensive play caller. Don't believe me? Look at what he did at Vanderbilt. And more importantly, go look what he did at Stanford as a defensive coordinator. Now he's at Oklahoma State, which to me is a downgrade. And you don't make that move unless things are bothering you. And sources told me that's the issue there. So is the problem Bryan Harsin? I know that his personality can be abrasive to developing relationships, particularly with coaches on his own staff. That was his MO at Boise State, from talking to people who have worked on his staff previously, people who have worked in the building at Boise State and Auburn. He's just that type of guy. He's kind of hard to work for. He's got a hammer fist, but when things are working, you obviously put up with it, but you also kind of buy into it and you love it. Listen, Bryan Harsin has a very clear vision of what he wants a program to be at Auburn. He had one at Boise State. I sat down with Bryan Harsin last May for about an hour in his office. And this guy has very clear and distinct goals, vision, and how to get there. It's just that his personality and the way he does it doesn't necessarily set up, as I always say, on the same wavelength as everybody else in that building. That includes staffers and that includes players. So make no mistake, the reason why the only coaches who have really stuck around consistently at Auburn under Harsin here early in his tenure, those guys were guys that coached with them at Boise State. They are on the same wavelength. They can put up with that abrasive personality. They can withstand the demands, but not everybody can. And it's not just necessarily working hard and asking guys to do more and more. It's the personality and the way you treat people and the way you conduct yourselves around them. Is that a bad thing about Bryan Harsin? I'm not judging him. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not even saying it's a great thing. It's probably a good thing. If things are working and you are conducting yourself that way, people will believe in you. But when you're losing and then coaches are leaving and you're not quite familiar with the school because you've never coached, east of the Mississippi River in your entire life, and you're adjusting to a new school, your first Power 5 gig as a head coach in the SEC where you've never coached, it can be difficult. Here's one positive I would pull from this if you're an Auburn fan as far as when it comes to Bryan Harsin. he's finally going to get the staff that he wanted all along. You know, when he came to Auburn, he had a great mix of assistant coaches with SEC ties, SEC head coaching experience, and coordinator experience. And most of those guys were coaches, obviously, he never coached with, but really weren't too familiar with. He also mixed that with some coaches he's worked with in the past, some he's had great connections with, and have come from that Chris Peterson, Bryan Harsin coaching tree at Boise State. But it was very clear that there was a little bit of a divide there between the Boise State coaches and the coaches who've been in the SEC for a while. They just didn't really quite see eye to eye. And that doesn't mean one side's right and one side's wrong. It's just that's how things work. But Bryan Harsin now has an opportunity to finally build the type of staff he wanted to from day one, which is his type of guys that will be on the same wavelength as him. So it is easy to judge Bryan Harsin at this moment and kind of say this isn't going to work. What I'm saying and what I've written in a column previously at 24/7 Sports is that this is an inflection point and things right now are going downhill fast, but it can be fixed because Auburn almost always rises to the occasion, especially these last 30 years. I mean, do they not? You guys watch them through history. It's one of the biggest roller coasters in all the country, not just the SEC. It's up, it's down, and when the highs are high, my goodness, they're super high. I was there in 2013, and all of you Auburn fans and college football fans saw what they were able to do in 2010 and in the mid-2000s under Tommy Tuberville, in the early 90s under Coach Bowden, and obviously in the 80s under Pat Dye. This is a blue blood program at Auburn. They're going through a bit of a hiccup right now. The question is Bryan Harsin the coach who can pull them out of this? I have no doubt in my mind the Auburn faithful, the Auburn family, as they say, has what it takes to pull Auburn out and bring him back to those highest of highs because they've done it before, whether it's through fan support, boosters, money, financial support, helping build that thing up, putting everybody on the right path, everybody being on the same page and same wavelength. Those Auburn fans, those boosters are, I hate saying second to none and unique, but they are unique. They're different from everybody else in the country. I've been around it. I've been around a lot of fans and programs. Those fans are different. They're fanatical, but they're also, they put their money where their mouth is and they help out that program. They also help the program by helping steer things the right way. And Auburn has always had former coaches, even former administrators that have been around that program, and even boosters have been around there. And that to them is almost their fantasy football team. You know, they're building a roster and all this stuff. And they can do that by hiring the right coaches and helping provide guidance. And I think Auburn, in some ways, is almost in a no man's land because, as I said, they're an inflection point, but they're in a period of transition here. You know, Pat Dye's gone. He left us. And I think that it's almost underrated a little bit just how much guidance and a calming force he provided in that building because he was in that building practically every day during a season and in the off season. And you almost always had someone on staff there working full time who was an Auburn guy that kind of understood everything. And I'm trying to convey to you that I can't because it's just words. You have to be around it. Whether it was Rodney Garner in the past, guys like Travis Williams, they don't really have that at Auburn right now. And I think that's hurting them. I think it's hurting Bryan Harsin too, because he doesn't quite understand it. He says he does because he has a blue collar approach about everything, which is what Auburn kind of embodies, but it's not. Bryan Harsin isn't the blue collar type coach that Auburn has had in the past. So where does Auburn go from here? They can pull themselves out of this and be back on the national map, and they could do so in the next couple of years. But the trends are not showing that right now. They're not doing a great job on the recruiting trail. They're not doing a great job in the transfer portal. They just aren't. Objectively, they aren't. You look at the numbers right now, the international signing day with the nation's number 16 recruiting class. At best, it looks like they'll finish in the top 15. Last year, Harsin's first year, they were number 19 in recruiting, which this all sounds respectable. The issue is that number 16 in the country right now ranks 7th in the 14-team SEC. And that's behind the likes of Mizzou, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Context is king. Contextually, these last two recruiting classes for Auburn combined are the worst on paper since 2008 and 2009. And Auburn was at an inflection point then too. Remember, that was the last year of the Tuberville era and the first year of the Gene Chizik era. Things weren't great. There was a transition. Then you started seeing the talent come to Auburn. Cam Newton, Nick Fairley. And then all of a sudden, you started seeing a spark there with the offense under Gus Malzahn his first year in 2009. And then going into 2010, they had these superstar players, including Cam Newton, who wasn't quite what we know him as now, but you knew there was promise there. And so Auburn really pulled itself out of the rut in a period of 2 calendar years. Auburn can do it again. Can they do it? Is Harsin the guy to do it? Potentially. But he's got to get players. Players win games. Coaches lose them. Simple as that. Another thing, I hurt for my Auburn friends. I do. This does mean a lot to me. I covered Auburn for a while. I lived there. I started a family there. And I hate to see this happening to Auburn football right now, them going through this, but I know it'll bounce back at some point. But what makes it more difficult right now, more difficult than ever, is that geographically and culturally, they are sandwiched by Alabama to the west and Georgia to the east. And Georgia just won a national title for the first time in 40 plus years, and Alabama is still in dynasty mode right now. Auburn has never faced that from their two chief rivals. No one in the country faces that. No one. And they're literally on the geographic map right in the middle between the two, competing against that every single day. It's every day. It's not just in the season. And Alabama and Georgia have dominated their series against Auburn the last 20 years. But when Auburn beats those teams, they're in the championship, baby. We've seen it, 2010, 2013. It happens. And in 2017, Auburn almost made the playoff, but lost to Georgia in a rematch in the SEC championship game. It can be done. It's been done, and it can be done again. But Auburn's missing a key piece here to all this. And I think that's the Auburn voice, the Auburn spirit, so to speak, in the program. I don't think Bryan Harsin has that in those walls for Auburn football right now. And as it stands right now, objectively, I think if you're being objective with all this and you removed your hat as an Auburn fan, you would say that Bryan Harsin is more likely to be fired in December after his second year than he is to get a contract extension. He's got to win, and he's got to win now. He's got to get some recruits on campus. He's got to get some big-time transfers. He has failed so far in doing those latter two things with recruiting. So now he's got to win, and he's got to do it with his guys on the coaching staff. And then he's got to translate that into a top 10 type recruiting class going in to 2023. Recruits win you national championships. Look what Texas A&M's doing right now, getting the best class in National Signing Day history. And Alabama and Georgia continue to recruit at a top 3, top 5 level. If you want to win a championship in the SEC, you got to be on that same wavelength. And like Bryan Harsin wants his staff and players to be on the same wavelength as him, Bryan Harsin needs to be on that same level as a recruiter.